Welcome to our study of Shantideva's The Way of the Bodhisattva. And as always, kindly generate the motivation of bodhicitta, which essentially is understanding what it is that we're doing on the path, is getting to addressing the universal cause of suffering, which is confusion, understanding the condition of samsara, understanding the innocence of all sentient beings, in that exclusively out of just sheer ignorance, in no way intending to create suffering for neither themselves nor others, sentient beings are lost in confusion. And as such, then engage in countless actions that they think might lead to their suffering, where they're driven by their habitual projections, karma, and yet still lost within this basic delusion of constructing a solid self and the object of the perception as solid, equally self and other, then endlessly engaging in what ultimately just brings about suffering. So this is where we, inspired by the physician, the Buddha, who has found the cure, that we ourselves are in treatment, and we do so with an awareness that on the basis of this treatment and the success of this treatment, we could actually proceed to benefit others. So with this kind of motivation, we're then engaging presently in the first aspect really of successfully getting to the bottom of suffering, which is cultivation of wisdom, and beginning with first what we call the wisdom of hearing. And on the basis of hearing the teaching, we then see how the teaching is relevant. We validate the teaching that we hear, we see how it's relevant for our situation, and we then apply what we've heard. And as thus we have then the three prajnas, or the three wisdoms: the hearing, reflecting, and meditating. So in this way, we are proactive in terms of getting to the very bottom of suffering. So presently we are studying then the 9th chapter of the Bodhisattva Guide. The 9th chapter is sometimes you just say the 9th chapter, and that in itself is, you could say, a phenomenon, an incredible, great phenomenon within the Mahayana, and particularly in the Prajnaparamita, the Madhyamaka, and so forth. Within the existing teachings on cultivating wisdom, the 9th chapter is viewed as one of the great classic works. And so we have some very significant commentaries on the 9th chapter. Notably, in you'd say in our tradition here, Jamgun Mipham Rinpoche's commentary on the 9th chapter is very well known, but we also have the commentaries on the 9th chapter from Minya Kunsang Sönam, Khenpo Kunsang Palden. And also yesterday, in the context of Rabjam giving lungs of Longchen Rabjam's works, then also he gave a lung for a commentary on the 9th chapter by somebody called Mewa Khenpo, I think it was Sönam Chokdrup. So this is a very big topic. Presently, what we have with His Holiness is a condensed presentation of the 9th chapter, and we're really just talking about some of the bigger concepts in the 9th chapter, and we're not going to be lingering too long on it. But essentially today we're going to be talking about the two truths. And I thought to just, because the two truths, as much as it comes up a lot in the Buddhist teaching, sometimes it still remains a little bit confused. And the two truths is essentially, it's experience with or without insight. It's seeing what we all see with or without wisdom. So when there's wisdom, then we understand that these apparent phenomena, they don't possess the solidity that we attribute to them. But on the other hand, just sort of going about, things as they are, we just refer to that as relative truth. And that's where we all come from, our own relative place. I see things my way, you're going to see things your way, but we might be looking at the same thing. For example, looking at the same text right now, but I'll have my view on it, you'll have your view, and so on. We're each sitting in our different location. We all have our individual perspective. This is relative truth, and that's very real for us. Wherever we're sitting, we're going to have to pay rent or mortgage, or we're going to have to vacuum, we're going to have to brush our teeth, look after ourselves. We, each and every one of us, have a particular reality that is ours and which is very real. We need to deal with it. The sage, same thing, but the sage also knows that this reality that we ordinarily engage in, and where we very often get caught up in a toxic delusional relationship with our perceptions, doesn't possess the solidity that we mistakenly attribute to it. So, for example, it's a bit like when we play with children, or if we're doing theater or whatever. We're acting in a way where we know that it functions, but it's not that real. Particularly with children, let's say we're building a sandcastle, and then we're all excited about the sandcastle with the children, but we also know it's not really a sandcastle. It's not an actual castle. Whereas for the children, well, they kind of know it too, but they're much more caught up in it. And that's where you could say there's an increased degree of prajna, and it doesn't mean that you don't have fun. Prajna doesn't mean that you no longer can play sandcastles. It doesn't mean that the sage doesn't have fun in the world. The sage has a lot more fun, because what happens when the bullies come over and kick the sandcastle, or the waves wash the sandcastle away, is not the end of the world. And then we just build another sandcastle. Whereas if you're very caught up in these phenomena, then you cry when the bully kicks the sandcastle or something goes wrong. And in this way, we in samsara, we suffer from not understanding. We don't have that perspective. There's you could say, lack of maturity. And so the insight that understands what we refer to as empty nature, in that it doesn't have the solidity that we have, that it appears to have, that wisdom, that prajna, constitutes then the insight of absolute truth. So that's a biggie. And so there's many ways in which philosophers, they have tried to sort of explain absolute truth, but the Buddha beautifully actually, he said, we're never going to understand reality on the basis of words or concepts. It's about having the individual disposition that's no longer caught up, that's free, that sees, just like we see that it is just a sandcastle and there's not that attachment. Similarly, also the sage sees this reality for what it is. And that's not about language. It's really more about not about concepts. It's not about philosophy. It's more actually freedom from this fundamental inability to settle into the experience of our ground nature. So we're just like somebody who's caught in a dream, and waking up doesn't mean that we construct a new reality. It's more that we're free from the dream, and as such we're free from all the suffering that was, you could say, inherent to the dream condition. And that's where the Bodhisattva, the Buddha, awakens from the dream. So in that sense, of course, within the dream, you can think, gosh, is there something more, and all of that, and the philosophers make up ideas. But within the dream, it's still not a free condition. And the beauty of this, particularly, is that the Buddha is not creating a new dogma. The Buddha is simply just saying, wake up, wake up. And then you say, yeah, what's it like being woken up? Could we please sort of write it down? And can we make a new dogma, a new philosophy? Can we make a religion? Can we make something out of it? And the Buddha said, look, I'll show you a path, but the liberation depends on you. And this path is about freeing ourselves, not developing new dogmas, concepts, and so forth. But it doesn't mean also that that it's hanging out. Of course, there's a path, there's a way. The physician gives us a way in which we can free ourselves. So His Holiness here says, the non-Buddhist traditions of ancient India also talked about absolute and relative truth. The Samkhya's, for example, regarded the primal substance as absolute truth, and the rest of the 25 objects of knowledge, such as the self, as relative truth. So these are examples where then there are ways to try to categorize and understand our experience. What's particular about the Samkhya tradition is then that they would say that the objects of knowledge, they arise are created by the primal substance, and as such we say cause and effect are the same. That's where again there's an attempt to philosophize something which really is just the produce of delusion. So again, this doesn't quite hit the mark. That's where, for example, in the Madhyamaka teachings, there's refutations just showing basically how these kind of philosophies, they're actually based on their own premise. There's a circular logic taking place, and it just doesn't hold. What's particularly beautiful about the Madhyamaka, and particularly the Prasangika Madhyamaka, is that they're just interested in showing that this philosophy doesn't hold. They're not interested in replacing it with a new, you could say, dogma about absolute truth. The Prasangikas and Madhyamikas, like everybody else, they'll show a path to how to become free, but they don't construct a philosophy about absolute truth. And that's in fact everything that we call Prajnaparamita, Madhyamaka, and so on. As much as you might call it Buddhist philosophy, it's really just a philosophy that shows that philosophy ultimately is just a conceptual construct. But of course, that message takes words. So we do talk about the middle way of words, Digi Uma. But then you have Döngi Uma, the absolute or the actual experience, the actual realization. And it's only that that's really what the teaching intends to convey to us. So His Holiness continues, then discussing the different, what we call philosophical tenets in the Buddhist school, of which there are 4. He says, even between the different Buddhist schools, the Vibhashika, the Vibhashmika it's called here. Normally we say Vibhashika, but same thing. Sochantika, Chittamatran, and Madhyamika, the two truths are explained in slightly different ways. So particularly if you've been following the Monday progressive stages of the path of on the meditation on emptiness, actually there Khenpo Tsultsun Gyatso, he goes through these various tenets. So we're studying these various tenets right now. So actually somebody very kindly said prayers. It's true, I forgot the prayers. Is it too late? Thank you for your patience, people. Let's just do the opening chants. Thank you very much. Abandon evil doing, practice virtue well. So do your mind. This is the Buddha's teaching. Like a star, an optical illusion, or a flame, a magical illusion, a dewdrop or a bubble, like a dream, a flash of lightning, or a cloud. So should one consider all compounded things. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. Thank you. Okay. So, the term relative is sometimes called an obscuring truth and sometimes a conventional truth, depending on the context. So the Tibetan is, these two are Kunsop and Tanye. Kunsop Demba and Tanye Demba. Now Kunsop literally means masking everything. So So that's the obscuring truth. Tanye just means conventional. That's just how we sort of choose to call things. So these are both ways in which we can understand relative truth. And His Holiness says absolute truth can also have many different meanings. The treatise on the center and extremes from Maitreya speaks of absolute truth, practiced absolute truth, and attained absolute truth. Again, in the Supreme Mantrayana, one speaks of the absolute luminosity. Moreover, to explain the specific practices of the Mantrayana, the two truths are explained in different ways. For example, the illusory and temporary aspect of phenomena is related to relative truth, while their aspect of primordial continuity is related to absolute truth. So that's, for example, in the Mantrayana, we would refer to all apparent phenomena when they are properly understood. And we would say when there's congruence or there's harmony between appearance and emptiness for the sage. For the person who sees clearly, phenomena exist as the unity of appearance and emptiness. And that's where we would say that understanding in which there's the understanding of appearance and emptiness as a unity, that's absolute truth. And when we don't understand it, that's relative truth. And it's within that understanding of understanding phenomena properly that we then refer to what we here call relative truth, all apparent phenomena, as mandala, as deity, and so forth, where all perceptions being understood in terms of the unity of appearance and emptiness is brought onto the path as purity. And that's where we engage in this yoga practice of visualization. That's where we visualize others as deity. We visualize the world as deity. We keep in mind how all forms are innately pure, how all sounds are innately pure. And that yoga practice is congruent with the relative truth as actually intrinsically, basically being what it is, namely pure, without our projections. So that's how in mantra teachings, then we would say relative truth is infinite purity. And also from that perspective, confusion, non-confusion, these are just ways of, you could say, construing properly or misconstruing the actual reality of phenomena as they intrinsically are. And as such, we would say all phenomena intrinsically are pure, intrinsically are free of any inherent existence. And as such, both samsara and nirvana, they take place within the same, what we call dhamma dhatu, or the same space of reality. And that's where we would say absolute truth is the great evenness. So in mantra teachings, we talk about relative truth as the great purity and absolute truth as the great evenness. So these are phenomena, or rather these are classifications that are quite useful as we're practicing the path. They don't constitute anything that adds to reality, but it enables us who are on the path to better approach and engage within this, you could say, this reality. So His Holiness says, so when we talk about the absolute truth, we should also always do so with reverence to the context, whether Sutrayana or Mantrayana, and if Mantrayana, to the particular Tantra. So this is particularly for us who are practicing the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, then we actually cannot be in agreement with any tradition in terms of what they will say about absolute truth. But we'll also understand that it really depends what the particular path is. So sort of from the Mantrayana perspective, it's a bit like there's an aerial perspective that appreciates how the understanding of absolute truth, of course, you could say conforms with whether practitioners are on the path of speaking from the point of view of the sutra, or they're speaking from the point of view of the Mantrayana. I'll give you one example. There's a very beautiful story in the Vimalakirti Nirdesa Sutra, which Tongtse Rinpoche has commented on. But there's a discussion between Subhuti and and a god called Brahmasikin. I often quote this story, so you might have heard it before. You see, Subhuti, who's essentially what we would call a Hinayanist, he sees the world as a place of suffering. And the Brahmasikin, Tsangpa Rinpoche, he's as a god, he has less obscurations, and he sees the world as a pure paradise. And so they're sort of discussing whether the world is a paradise or it's a dreadful place. And they go before the Buddha, and the Buddha actually has something to say to Subhuti. And he, for a moment, he can actually remove Subhuti's obscuration. And the Subhuti sees the world in its purity. And so then the Buddha says, you know, I can't do anything about that. It is due to the particular dispositions of sentient beings that they're obscured and perceive things on the basis of their duality and their obscurations. They see the world as impure. So in that sense, he's saying the God is less obscured. And so that's the basis also for the Mantrayana teachings. When we visualize the world in terms of its purity, it's more aligning ourselves with the way that phenomena actually exist. We're not denying that sentient beings suffer within this world because of their obscurations, because of how they're seeing things. It's very real for the individual sentient beings in terms of all the suffering. But you could say, nature of phenomena itself is free from the projections that we have onto phenomena. And that's where then the Mantrayana takes this, what we call the resultant perspective, whereas the Sutrayana takes more the view from the ordinary obscured perspective. And so that's where, when we come across this, and we come across this a lot in the Mantrayana, we need to understand how this works in terms of the perspective. And also understanding which is more valid perspective, but at the same time also, we need to understand, as much as we might be Mantrayana practitioners, then also we do humbly acknowledge that we might be blind to the purity ourselves. And so we also are very dependent on the approach of the Sutrayana that takes the obscured perspective into consideration. So His Holiness says, we should then gain a precise understanding of absolute truth within that context. This is very important. If we try to apply only a general understanding of absolute truth to some specific text, we can get very confused. It is said in the root verses of the Middle Way, this is Nagarjuna's famous work, the Mula Madhyamika Karika, that the teachings of the Buddha rely on the two truths, the truth of the relative world and the supreme absolute truth. This is explained in detail in the entrance to the Middle Way, the Madhyamika Avatara, which is the teaching that Tsongtse Rinpoche taught to his students for a decade or so, the introduction to the Middle Way. And that says that all phenomena are perceived both correctly and mistakenly. And we, as a consequence, apprehend their nature in two ways. What is correctly perceived is absolute truth, and what is perceived incorrectly is relative truth. So that makes a difference. Phenomena themselves don't change. It's how we are seeing properly or not seeing. Are we seeing a snake or are we seeing a rope? So that's the difference lies in the subject. So that's where we say there's a difference between how an ordinary confused person sees things and how an awake person sees things. So His Holiness says this refers to the findings of non-conceptual experience related to absolute truth, and those of conceptual analysis related to relative truth. So that's where, in the context of the Madhyamika teachings, then we understand that the unconfused mind that is free from the ordinary projections and concepts sees clearly. But on the path, we apply analysis. We apply this quality of prajna that looks. And it's a very wholehearted process. This analysis is not, you could say, an intellectual exercise for the sake of something that we might sort of do because it makes us feel good, or we are addicted to intellectual exercises or whatever. It's simply just the practice of actually being willing, being curious, inquisitive, and looking. And it's that kind of analysis that begins then to see. And that's what's encouraged a lot in the Madhyamaka teaching, the conceptual analysis that looks at our perceptions. And that's then that which is related to relative truth. So His Holiness said, it is on the basis of these that we establish our understanding of emptiness. But here we're only talking about the non-conceptual experience of the absolute truth. With this exception, the ways of distinguishing the truth are the same as in the entrance to the middle way. So right now, when you could say deconstruct, we eliminate the ordinary assumptions. We apply a critique to our beliefs and assumptions. We're then freed up. And that's what you could say is the general understanding of the middle way. Of course, there's also the qualities that arise from that. And this is what we sometimes refer to as the greater middle way, that there's also within that the understanding of how the qualities of Buddha nature, they are spontaneously present. But anyway, right now, the first thing before we sort of get we fall too much in love with the idea of all the spontaneously present qualities, there first has to be this rather sober, or rather this sort of sobering up, this sort of hard intelligence that just looks at our assumptions and sees how they're deceiving us. His Holiness says, why do we need to realize emptiness? We do not wish to suffer, and we know that the root of suffering is the untamed mind, the confused mind. Because the mind perceives and understands things mistakenly, negative emotions arise, and the mind is never at peace. This is why we suffer. To avoid this, we must develop the unmistaken mind, the intelligence that perceives the true nature of phenomena. Mistaken perception arises because we fail to see things as they are. Actually, if anybody has ever wondered, what are we doing with all this Buddhist teaching on Madhyamaka? I mean, you have persons who, practice Buddhism their whole life, and yet it's like, yeah, but I like to do what Guruji says, but I don't want to have anything to do with that Madhyamaka. That's for those scholars, intellectuals. I'm just, staying with the nature of mind. And it's really great if it's possible to stay with the nature of mind. But honestly, it's so important that we understand that what we're doing is really just getting to the bottom of why we suffer. So this single paragraph here, you could sort of write out in gold and really memorize that, because this really is where His Holiness says so clearly, the reason why we want to realize this emptiness is because simply we don't want to suffer, and we're getting to the bottom of suffering. That's what is being said here. So His Holiness says, much of what we perceive in, hold on, my little Kindle here is fixating on, it's got my Kindle, hello. What if I do that? Tricked it. Okay. Much of what we perceive, we perceive in a mistaken way, seeing things not as they truly are. This is how we become deluded. To avoid this, we should not accept our perceptions just as we experience them. It is very important to analyze and investigate whether we are seeing things as they truly are. We should ask ourselves what our perceptions are masking. If we do this, an understanding of the two truths will arise in our mind. And this is again, the term kunzop means our perceptions, our building or projecting or constructing realities on the basis of the phenomena that are there. That's we're actually masking reality. And so you can say the reality behind an appearance is emptiness. That's the reality. But it's masked as computer, watch, microphone, etc., etc. These are masks that are actually veiling the reality of emptiness. And we're not saying, oh well, if we were then to become enlightened, everything would just be emptiness. What's so nice about that? Okay, I'm no longer suffering, but maybe I'd rather suffer. Isn't there more spice in life if I'm suffering rather than be stuck in some empty realm? And that's not what we're saying. And that's where sometimes we would say with Madhyamaka, there is a danger that we could fall into this kind of nihilism. But what the Madhyamaka teaching is saying is that no, it's on the contrary. It's like right now we have a half-life because of our masking reality and failing to see the fluid, vibrant, actual nature. Then we're continually caught up in this pattern of reaction, like and dislike, consolidating a rigid self, consolidating a hallucination of other. And as such, we're not really having much of a life. And that is what samsara is. What the Buddha would like us to do is to be free. And that's where the vision of enlightenment, yes, it does come with all the qualities of freedom, all the joy, the love, the strength, and the infinite qualities that you could see manifest manifest in a sage. So again, like I'm always saying, when you look at a sage, you're not looking at some sort of condition of flatline experience. You're looking at exuberance and flourishing. And this is what the Buddha would like us to achieve. This is what the Buddha would like to see us well, and he's sad to see us suffering unnecessarily. So, so His Holiness says, to avoid this, we should not accept our perceptions just as we experience them. It is very important to analyze and investigate whether we are seeing things as they truly are. We should ask ourselves what our perceptions are masking. If we do this, an understanding of the true truth will arise in our mind. We'll see, yes, there's a relative watch, but also it in fact doesn't have the reality that I'm attributing to it. And it makes us much easier. We have a much, as you can look at the Dalai Lama, or the Buddha or the sage, they're having a good time. So His Holiness says, all we perceive, mountains, houses, and so on, affect us in one way or another. We need to investigate their real nature. Our perceptions and the positive and negative aspects that we attribute to them constitute relative truth. Relative truth is what we find when we experience the multiplicity of phenomena in a relative way, without going any further in analyzing the nature. The findings of the analysis by the conventional mind constitute relative truth. If, according to absolute truth, things have no true existence, why do we speak of relative truth as truth? So, if we have established that relative truth, in fact, isn't absolutely true, why do we call it true? Because His Holiness says it is true for the perceiver. It is true for the mind clouded by ignorance, which believes in the reality of its perceptions. As the entrance to the middle way says, that which is altered and obscured by ignorance and is perceived as real is called relative truth. So His Holiness says, for which mind is the multiplicity of phenomena true? It can only be the confused, ignorant mind that believes that things exist objectively. The true nature of things is obscured by the mind's ignorant clinging to things and to the way they function. Thus, relative truth is based on the findings of the minds that examine things in a conventional way. And again, like Tongsa Khyentse Rinpoche says, what is so, you could say, tricky about relative truth is that it's so convincing. It functions so beautifully. our entire science, with all its brilliance, all its technology, its findings in medicine and so on, is all based on this analysis of the conventional perception. And it is remarkable in the way that it understands the functioning of our world. So in one sense, we could say the modern science is profoundly insightful, and yet it lacks this insight of absolute truth. So that's where we have a science, but it's still confined to the relative conventional perceptions. All respect to that, but what we're talking about here is a science that goes deeper, a greater science that takes into account the actual abiding nature of things beyond just appearances. And it's at that point that you then have the dividing line between Buddhas and sentient beings, sages and ordinary persons, because even someone has a tremendous insight in the functioning of the conventional world, the mind is still not free. It's only when we begin to apply this insight to the subjective mind that we then are able to understand where the dividing line between confusion and non-confusion takes place, and we're able to then eliminate confusion and realize the actual nature of mind. And that's for this reason His Holiness then says, if we analyze further and try to see the true nature of phenomena, we can find the ultimate nature of reality. Here we distinguish between the way things appear, relative truth, and the way they are, absolute truth, which is what is perceived by the undiluted mind. There are two ways of approaching absolute truth. A positive idea of it can be gained through listening, reflecting, and meditating. These are the three prajnas, right? And an understanding of it in terms of negation can be gained by analysis. And that's where, when we are approaching absolute truth, we apply a critique. We begin to actually say, well, should I believe everything I think? Should I believe my perceptions? Should I be stuck on just appearances? And that's where we begin to practice what we call negation. We begin to see there's something here there's a deception that is what we then call the object of negation. His Holiness says, it stands to reason that if one can find through analysis anything that truly exists, one should also be able to find it through listening, reflecting, and meditating. And that's where, if we could find something that we call that withstands analysis, then fine, then it's okay, it would have absolute reality. But there's nothing, not even nirvana, not even enlightenment, not even Buddha nature, that you could say withstands analysis. The trick, of course, is that the prajna, that which recognizes that you could say withstands analysis. It is what is real. It is the enlightened condition, but that enlightened condition is premised on that freedom from any reference point. So there will never be anything that you could say has some true inherent existence. And that doesn't matter whether we're talking about phenomena in the enlightened condition or the non-enlightened condition. This is just how reality simply is. But knowing or not knowing this makes the difference. So nothing, His Holiness says, nothing we won't be able to find anything that truly exists. But His Holiness says, the fact is, what one can find through listening, reflecting, and meditating cannot be found by analysis. The absolute nature, for example, is something that can be experienced through listening, reflecting, and meditating. So there's the relative phenomena that we cannot objectify, cannot find, but we can, you could say, find inroads to the actual experience of the absolute nature through the path of listening, reflecting, and meditating. His Holiness says, when one investigates the nature of the individual and of all phenomena, one finds that their nature is emptiness. So the nature of the individual is what we call self of person. we will find that that nature is emptiness. When we look at the phenomena, we call that the self of phenomena. We also find that is empty. This emptiness is an absolute truth that is apparent to the mind. One can see it with one's awareness. Once it has been experienced, it's not necessary to demonstrate it again. So it's like once we see that the rope is not a snake. Once we've sort of cottoned on to say, oh, there was no snake. Once we see that the paper tiger is no real tiger, and so forth, then we're no longer deceived. Zola says, by referring to one's experience of this nature, one can recall it. So that's why we analyze to get to the bottom of actually saying, hey, this phenomena really just exists as an appearance that takes place on the basis of certain causes and conditions. Just like twirling a firebrand looks like there's a solid ring of fire, but in fact it's just something that we're projecting, experiencing on the basis of certain causes and conditions. Twirling, the speed of the twirling and the fire. There is no actual ring of fire. So that's why once we cotton on to this, once we see this, then we are less prone to being delusional. Its existence is true, and one does not have to rely on argument that proves that it exists. So when one has some confidence that no phenomena truly exist, one does not need to have this explained again and again or to repeat the investigation. And that is where we talk about having certainty in the view, because that's where once we finally get that, then we don't need to rely on continually going back to having these teachings over and over. Otherwise, not finishing that homework, like I was saying the other day, you might be involved with this, with the practice of the path for ages, and you're still sort of like, going here and there and looking for all sorts of interesting theories and like, oh, I just found out something in quantum physics. I just found out something there. I just found out something here, and it's never ending. Whereas if we once and for all really cut through this, then we kind of know what it is that needs to be done. There's an understanding that then just needs to be deepened. So His Holiness says this absolute nature that is established through listening, reflecting, and meditating is something we can experience. He says, however, when one looks for this absolute nature or emptiness and tries to find where it is, one cannot find it. Its nature is non-existent. When one makes this absolute nature that one has experienced through listening, reflecting, and meditating the object of analysis, one cannot find it. This is why it is called non-existent by nature. So again, this comes back to that this nature is not something that can be objectified. It's an insight that phenomena cannot be grasped, but that insight in itself is not something to be grasped. So we can have an idea about emptiness, what we call a generic image, Dunchi. That is valid, and that, you could say, informs our journey. It's the map, but it's not the territory. And so that's where we understand the nature of both the phenomena of confusion and the phenomena of awakening. They are things that cannot be grasped. His Holiness says, to take an example, we can say that a vase has the nature of emptiness. But when we look for that emptiness, it is non-existent. All we can find is the emptiness of emptiness, but we cannot find emptiness. So emptiness is not a thing. So when we could say emptiness of emptiness, it sounds kind of trippy and sort of, whoa, but it really just means that emptiness is also not God or a thing or some cosmic substance. It's actually great news. It means there's actually freedom. There's not something that has to be known or grasped, and that's also why there's tremendous compassion and tremendous accommodation. What has been found by experiencing it through listening, reflecting, and meditating cannot be found through such analysis. And that's where in the teachings like Mahamudra, then we have these words where we say the great discovery of nothing to discover. the great finding of that which cannot be found, and so forth. Yeah? It sounds mystical, but it's not indulging in sophistry, or it's not indulging in mysticism. It's a very important point. But it's also an important point that really spells out tremendous freedom. It's the statement about the openness of our reality that is not limited into concepts, language, any kind of way of limiting it in terms of some sort of category or expression. So His Holiness says this is an important point. The understanding of absolute truth that comes from listening, reflecting, and meditating is something that exists and can be experienced. So it's for real. But, he says, in the absolute truth that appears through the analysis even of emptiness, there is nothing that exists. So we have something that's very real. The sage's realization is very real. One sage meets another sage, and they're like, they know that this other person has it. The other person knows that there's a recognition that this is what the Buddhas of the past have recognized. This is reality. And yet the beauty of it is that there's nothing about it that can be grasped. So Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo, he gave this advice when he said, when you're establishing the view, it's so important that you understand this dimension that all phenomena in and of themselves are empty. When you're establishing the view, that's so important. When you're practicing the path, to have that sense of, yes, this is real. What I'm doing here is for real. It's not about concepts, but it's about insight, recognition. To have that while we're on the path is so important. So for those who are familiar with the sort of Madhyamika language, Khyentse Wangpo would say, at the time of establishing the view, emphasis should be on rangtong, the intrinsic emptiness. For the time when we're on the path, then the emphasis should be on the shentong, you could say, absence of confusion, but there's still the sense of non-confusion, that there's some clarity that we're meditating on. Okay. I can't remember the saying correctly, but I think it says something about wiping the sand from our eyes between studying different traditions so as not to bring preconceptions from one to the other. Yeah, I mean, once we have the sort of aerial perspective, especially the one we're talking about here today, then there's an ease with everything. Everything kind of just fits beautifully, whether it's theistic practices or whatever it might be. There's an understanding how truth is relative and how truth is constructed differently in various ways, you know? And also from that perspective, also how ultimately these are all just relative expressions. But at the same time, also in terms of actually practicing the path and gaining the actual experience, there's a certain emphasis on just staying with one's particular lineage, you know? That's where one's, you could say, experience could really be deepened through actually practicing according to one's particular teacher's instructions. That's where we move from just a very good intellectual understanding into actual genuine experience. Then someone says, what paragraph? Oh yeah, because I was banging on about the value of one particular paragraph. Okay, let's go back and find it. It was here. This is where I had the issue with the highlighting, yeah, because I was thinking I should highlight this. This one here. Okay, I'll read it one more time. So, why do we need to realize emptiness? We do not wish to suffer, and we know that the root of suffering is the untamed mind. Because the mind perceives and understands things mistakenly, negative emotions arise, and the mind is never at peace. This is why we suffer. To avoid this, we must develop the unmistaken mind, the intelligence that perceives the true nature of phenomena. Mistaken perception arises because we fail to see things as they are. Okay? So this is something we could write down with gold ink. Let's see here. This is $1 million teaching. Exactly, yes. You know, you probably, some of you would have come across the great sage Jigme Lingpa. Let's see. Yeah, Jigme Lingpa has in the top knot, he has a little volume. And this is, you could say, pretty much what that volume contains is what we're discussing here today. Can you please repeat the beautiful way you expressed it? Relative is the purity and the absolute is the evenness. That makes so much sense. Yeah, you come across that a lot in the mantra teachings. So yes, essentially purity is seeing the unity of appearance and emptiness. And it's from that point of view that we understand phenomena themselves. There's nothing wrong with them. They are pure. That's how things actually are. And that's why we understand the purity of phenomena, and hence to engage that understanding, we visualize the world as a mandala. We understand that the subject intrinsically also is intrinsically undiluted, and as such we visualize ourselves. And you could say the mandala, the threefold mandala of completeness in terms of skandhas, the skandhas, the elements, and the ayatanas as deity. So we have this perception of relative truth as mandala and deity, and that's the purity. That's engaging the purity of relative truth according to the mantra vehicle. And absolute is then the evenness, the equality of samsara and nirvana. So relative truth is purity, absolute truth is evenness. Maybe once we start to see the emptiness in imputed truth, we could reinforce that view with a more humorous outlook, continually giving dreamed up, non-conventional groupings of causes and conditions, imputed new nonsensical labels. Yeah, we could do that. Yeah, have a bit of fun, turn things upside down, for sure. There's a lot of practices like that, actually. And that's also how some yogis would actually, in Buddhist countries, probably not recommended to do around here, but you know, in Buddhist countries, you did have yogis who sometimes would do things that, you know, to ordinary people would seem a bit sort of nonsensical, you know. But yeah, and I mean, what we really are talking about here is this aerial perspective in which there's no longer the investment of me, and as such, there's greater lightness around the phenomenal world. So there's also there's a bit more lightness and laughter going on. So yes, the phenomenal world is funny, and the seriousness of us who take it for real is kind of funny. The only thing is, the Buddhas don't sit around laughing at sentient beings for their delusion. They understand, just like we with children. We don't, you know, the waves come in, wash out the sandcastle, but we don't laugh at the kids. It kind of breaks our hearts. So there is a comedy in some way, but there's also a heartbreak taking place. And that's also why the sages, they would laugh at their own. You could say the sages that, you know, sages would still have some residual issues, and then they would laugh at themselves. But as far as others go, maybe with their close disciples that are sort of ready for it. But for rest of the condition of sentient beings, the Buddhas essentially have empathy and compassion. Yeah? Can purity be understood not in the way that it is pure, meaning beautiful, but the way that it is pure, meaning free of concepts? Well, that's exactly what purity means. So purity doesn't mean that it's sort of like goody or beautiful or sort of, yeah. No, it means accurate. So it's actually, it means, yeah, the accurate, pure seeing here means seeing accurately. So when we talk about pure perception, we're not talking about imagining something looking very nice. We're talking about seeing things for what they are. And that's what pure perception means. We call it sacred outlook. We call it pure perception. But it really means seeing things properly, fully. Yeah. without the overlay of our tainted dualistic perception. Yeah. But it's very helpful for us to then engage that vision on the basis of seeing ourselves, and they're portrayed. You could say there's a natural quality that comes from that, that manifests in terms of elegance, beauty, vigor, and so forth, because it's sort of, it's like something that, you know, when you have a plant that grows, there's a place where it really peaks, and it's sort of like just at the right place, you know, and that kind of beauty that sort of really presents its potential, reflects its, you could say, nature of sorts. And that's where, likewise, also when we visualize Sambhogakaya deities, mandala, and so on, it's in alignment with the, you could say, vibrancy, the sort of unchanging vibrancy of reality. So important how you really define purity. Some people take it literally that it means goody-goody, as you refuted. Yeah. Well, that's very important when we present Mantrayana. That's why, you know, the teachings like the Guhyagarbha Tantra are so essential, in conjunction with the instructions on visualizing. Because if we just think visualizing is sort of like applying some rosy colored picture, then it would almost mean that we're ignoring we're ignoring things. So it would sort of lead us into a bad place. Yeah, it wouldn't connect us with reality. It would distance ourselves from reality. Can you give an actual example of seeing something wrongly imputed in that pure way? Well, you know, we have it actually in epistemology. You know, you put a stick in water and you can actually see it looks like the stick bends. Yeah, there you are looking at it. That's actually seeing things. That's sort of what we call warped relative truth. So that happens, you know. And then we have seeing the stick straight. That's what we call valid relative truth. But from the point of view of absolute, the absolute nature, then we talk about on one hand, seeing the emptiness, and on the other hand, seeing the purity of relative truth, of our appearances, the purity of appearances. This, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, takes us to the subject of the next study, which actually will look at the various ways that we understand what we call confined perception, this ordinary conventional perception, and then the perception of sages. That will actually begin to really line up, you could say, the perspectives that we have according to the conventional outlook and also the outlook of wisdom. So the sword of wisdom coming up next is really the sword of wisdom is that prajna that cuts through delusion. And it will be a very important study, particularly for us who come from the modern culture of analysis, critical thinking. You know, we're all supposed to be, you know, intelligent, critical persons that are not easily deceived. We try to find the source of the news that is not biased in a warped way. When someone says something, we think of it critically. We ask, where did you get that information? And we've been brought up to think critically, not gullibly and naively. So the sword of wisdom very much is one that clearly explains what can we validate as true, and why would we validate it as true, and why is it we fall for deceptive appearances? When does Sword of Wisdom say? 30th of March. We might have a little bit of a break here on Wednesdays. So I just thought to have a date, and I've kind of set it to, I've set it to 30th of March. So we might have a, next Wednesday, we'll do the last chapter, I think, dedication. And then there'll be a few weeks of hiatus. So you can go out and do something else for those Wednesday mornings. And your minds will be fresh. for the next study. Yeah. Okay. So next week we'll look at the last chapter, the chapter of dedication. This is actually, we have these lines that go as long as space remains, as long as the world remains, may I too remain for the benefit of beings. That actually comes from this 10th chapter here, the dedication chapter. Okay, so that's what we'll look at next time. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you very much, and we shall meet again next week. Thank you.